Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. This is our 68th episode on September 2nd, 2021. My name is Andy Zee. I'm the host of the show, coming to you from Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Sunsara Taylor. I'm the co-host of the RNL show.
Sunsara, this has been a week that tears your heart open. The images you've seen on TV, on the internet, on social media, and in the newspapers. Burning, drowning. Athens on fire, possibly becoming uninhabitable. Lake Tahoe here in California, Nevada, potentially going up in flames. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres under fire. Drowning in Mississippi, Louisiana, New Orleans. The levees held, but just barely. And they're telling people not to come back. This is climate change that's destroying the planet, caused by this system of capitalism, imperialism.
Then we have the fascist pandemic, fueled by these science-denying, genocidal, racist GOP lunatics refusing to wear masks, celebrating as a matter of freedom, refusing to get the vaccine, spreading this disease that is claiming millions of lives and hitting Black people, Latino people, and immigrants and Native Americans especially hard in this country.
And this last week, we've seen the images from Afghanistan, 20 years of a U.S. war for empire. We hear a lot about the 2,000 plus U.S. service people killed, but very little about the 200,000 plus people of Afghanistan who've been killed, the internal refugees. The fact that the U.S. has said this is going to liberate the women of Afghanistan, when in fact most of the women of Afghanistan have never seen any benefit. And now they're all being subjected to the rule of the Taliban, once again, a reactionary Islamist force. We'll be talking more about that today.
Yeah, and speaking of the Taliban, we got to go down and look at Texas, where the American Taliban, straight up Christian fascist lawmakers, have now made it illegal in the state of Texas to get an abortion after approximately 6 weeks into pregnancy, long before most women know they are pregnant. This is a nightmare for women, and it is threatening to spread across this country very quickly. And we must say, and we're going to get into this in this episode too, forced motherhood is female enslavement.
When you think about this, and you see the images, and you think seriously about people's lives, this is a dystopian world. What does dystopia mean? It's an imagined world or society in which people lead dehumanized and fearful lives, like you saw in the movie and the books, The Hunger Games. The linguistic opposite of dystopia is utopia. But on this show, we're not talking about utopia, some imagined world that might be. We're talking about something very real. It's very possible. It really could be. It's an actual revolution to overthrow this system that perpetuates all these things we've been talking about, that is responsible for most of them, and it could be swept off the face of the earth in this time. This is a rare time when revolution becomes possible to bring about a far better world for the emancipation of all humanity. The framework of today's show comes from the RevComs, a declaration, a call to get organized now for a real revolution, which sharply puts forward an understanding that Bob Avakian has developed and been arguing for some time. Let me read this from the declaration and call. The crisis and deep divisions in society now can only be resolved through radical means of one kind or another, either radically reactionary, murderously oppressive and destructive means, or radically emancipatory, revolutionary means. Why is this rare opportunity upon us? It says in this same part of the declaration, a call, those who have ruled over us for so long with their Republican and Democratic parties are now caught up bitterly fighting each other over how to hold this country together, to keep this system going and enforce its rule over the people it exploits and oppresses, and maintain this country as the world's top dog oppressive power.
It is really easy right now to see the ugly future barreling towards humanity. It is very precious that Bob Avakian and the RevComs have analyzed deeply in the nature of this system, which is also something we're going to get into in this episode. What is this system? But in the nature of this system and the crisis it is now going through, there is the basis for a positive resolution, to wrench a revolution, the emancipation of humanity out of this very crisis. But that requires all of us to enter into that fight right now, to get with this revolution, to get with this leader, Bob Avakian, who is the foremost revolutionary thinker and leader in the world today, who's developed a scientific approach to making revolution, a vision of a whole new society that we could bring into being, and who is actively leading right now all of us to rise to this challenge. So this is what we're going to invite you into in this episode.
And there is a way for you to get involved that's spelled out in a declaration, a call. And there's a whole strategy to actually make and win a revolution that's been developed by Bob Avakian. But we want to start this show by making it very clear, as it says in a declaration and call, to make it very clear once more. By revolution, we mean nothing less than overthrowing this whole system, defeating, disarming, and dismantling the murderous armed power and other institutions that enforce this system, completely abolishing this whole system, and replacing it with something radically different and much better, a new society built on an entirely different foundation. This is not some little reform. This is not even a big reform. This is not even a rebellion. This is talking about getting organized now for the chance to do away with a system that brought you and is bringing you and is continuing to do all the things that we began this show with. This has been a monster that has ridden the backs of the masses of people for centuries now, and its time is up. There's so much unnecessary suffering. We need to slay dragons. And that to slay the dragons is going to involve all of you. But I'm hoping that you could read what we're slaying dragons for, continuing this same paragraph.
All right, so this is also from the Declaration, a call to get organized now for a real revolution. It says, and this new system we need is socialism, an economic and political system that is set up to meet the needs of the people, not the profit and power of exploiters and oppressors. A system that moves to do away with all exploitation and oppression and supports people everywhere fighting against oppression and exploitation in order to get to a communist world where all this madness will finally be ended for real and people all over the world will be able to work together for the common good. That's what this show is about. That's what this revolution is about. And that's what you need to be about starting now and going forward.
So in today's episode, we're going to get into just two of the outrages that we spoke of at the beginning of today's show. One, Afghanistan. And two, the situation that's now developed in Texas, this handmaid's tale of a Gilead. And then we're going to have a segment from Bob Avakian. And what is a system? What is the system that that confronts us that we need to overthrow? And there'll be some other things on the show as well. Let's go first off right to this segment on the new abortion law in Texas.
On September 1st, the state of Texas banned all abortions for all women after approximately 6 weeks into pregnancy. This is long before most women even know they are pregnant. On Tuesday, before this law went into effect, the clinics in Texas were flooded with women desperate to get an abortion before it became illegal. Up until the stroke of midnight, these clinics were seeing women. And then on Wednesday, these same clinics were forced to turn these women away. Think of the terror of a 17-year-old finding out that she is pregnant from a guy she barely knew, looking at and hoping of her dreams for college and her life before her being shut down. Think of the helplessness of a mother struggling to support 2 or 3 or more children who can't take on another child. Think of the desperation of a woman living in her car or trapped in an abusive relationship. And think of the insult and cruelty to every and any woman who finds herself pregnant and just does not want to have a child for whatever reason at that point in her life or at all. And then multiply that as thousands and thousands of more of these circumstances pile up day after day. Lives foreclosed, dreams shattered, desperation deepened, relations of abuse bolted more firmly into place, and a message sent to all women and all girls that no matter what else you aspire to, no matter what else you achieve, you are little more than an incubator. Let's call this what it is. Forced motherhood is female enslavement. And this is not confined to Texas, as bad as that would be. Next month, the Supreme Court of the United States is going to hear a direct challenge to the landmark Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, which legalized abortion. This could gut or overturn abortion rights nationwide. We are facing a tipping point in what has been a decades-long Christian fascist war on women's lives, a war to subordinate women to their husbands enforced by the state to reduce women to property of men and breeders of children. This is a future which must not be accepted. People should be filling the streets with outrage, refusing to let this go down. Over 35 years ago, Bob Avakian made the very deep and prescient analysis, far-sighted analysis, which I want to quote. He said, "The whole question of the position and role of women in society is more and more acutely posing itself in today's extreme circumstances." This is a powder keg in the U.S. today. It is not conceivable that all this will find any resolution other than in the most radical terms and through extremely violent means. The question yet to be determined is, will it be a radical reactionary or a radical revolutionary resolution? Will it mean the enforcing of the chains of enslavement or the shattering of the most decisive links in those chains and the opening up of the possibility of realizing the complete elimination of all such forms of enslavement? This is posed very immediately right now on this question of abortion and the whole position and role of women in society, and it's posed on many other fault lines in society right now too. And it's very easy, if you have your eyes open, to see the nightmare, the reactionary resolution that is barreling towards us. But we also need to understand that in the coming apart of the norms that have been in this society, including the right to abortion, there is the potential to wrench a radically revolutionary and emancipating future. This is bringing to the fore the need and ripening the basis to bring forward a revolutionary alternative. And people need to, right now, in the midst of this crisis, lift their sights to and learn about why a revolution is needed, what this revolution entails, and what kind of society, liberating, emancipating society, it is aiming to bring into being. You need to learn about Bob Avakian and the revolutionary leadership he is providing for this revolution, and you need to get into this revolution. The fate of women and of humanity is really what's at stake. And as you get into this, and right now, for everybody in society who does not want to see women slammed backwards and enslaved, the immediately posed question is, will we rise and be in the streets? Will we stop this fascist assault? This is a moment, again, for the streets to be filled with the outrage of millions, for artists to speak, for public intellectuals to speak, for everybody to use whatever platform they have to refuse to allow this to go down. Doing this requires breaking decisively with the deadly logic of the Democratic Party and of the so-called women's groups and pro-choice groups that are tied to the Democratic Party, that insist on playing by the rules, even as the rules are shattered, that insist on relying on the courts and the legislatures, even as the courts and the legislatures are packed with fascists and turned into instruments of fascist atrocity, that refuse to mobilize the outrage of millions, even as women's lives and futures are being foreclosed. We need people in the streets in outrage right now. And we need this link to people lifting their sights and getting it organized for an actual revolution to get us beyond this system that has patriarchy woven into its foundation and is fueling this fascist assault. We need a different world. Women need abortion on demand and without apology. Fetuses are not babies. Abortion is not murder, and women are not incubators. Forced motherhood is female enslavement. We need to break the chains and unleash the fury of women as a mighty force for revolution. So with that, we want to close this segment on abortion by bringing you two clips that bring alive the spirit and the daring that we need much more of right now. The first is from Paxton Smith, a recent high school graduate down in Texas who threw out her pre-approved valedictorian speech and spoke to this emergency facing women. And that'll be immediately followed by a clip from 2014 of the abortion rights freedom ride that I led down in Texas, standing up against a previous wave of anti-abortion clinic closures, getting arrested, and both of these give you a taste of what we need to see much more of right now. Let's watch.
Lake Highlands, class of 2021, your valedictorian, Paxton Smith.
I'm not usually very good at expressing my gratitude for the people that I care about, but I would like to say thank you to Coach. I think he's had a bigger role in my life than he realizes. Okay. As we leave high school, we need to make our voices heard. Today, I was going to talk about TV and media and content because it's something that's very important to me. However, under light of recent events, it feels wrong to talk about anything but what is currently affecting me and millions of other women in the state. Recently, the heartbeat bill was passed in Texas. Starting in September, there will be a ban on abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, regardless of whether the pregnancy was a result of rape or incest. 6 weeks. That's all women get. And so before they realize, most of them don't realize that they're pregnant by 6 weeks. So before they have a chance to decide if they are emotionally, physically, and financially stable enough to carry out a full-term pregnancy, before they have the chance to decide if they can take on the responsibility of bringing another human being into the world, that decision is made for them by a stranger. A decision that will affect the rest of their lives is made by a stranger. I have dreams and hopes and ambitions. Every girl graduating today does. And we have spent our entire lives working towards our future. And without our input and without our consent, our control over that future has been stripped away from us. I am terrified that if my contraceptives fail, I am terrified that if I am raped, then my hopes and aspirations and dreams and efforts for my future will no longer matter. I hope that you can feel how gut-wrenching that is. I hope you can feel how dehumanizing it is to have the autonomy over your own body taken away from you. And I'm talking about this today, on a day as important as this. On a day honoring 12 years of hard academic work, on a day where we are all gathered together, on a day where you are most inclined to listen to a voice like mine, a woman's voice, to tell you that this is a problem, and it's a problem that cannot wait. And I cannot give up this platform to promote complacency and peace when there is a war on my body and a war on my rights. A war on the rights of your mothers, a war on the rights of your sisters, a war on the rights of your daughters. We cannot stay silent. Thank you.
We're with the Abortion Rights Freedom Ride, and we have volunteers who've come from across the country. We're standing in the midst of students on their first day of class because the future of this generation is being determined right now.
Get them out here! There's an emergency facing women in this country!
On Monday, the state of Texas is about to carry out the single greatest round of clinic closures to hit a single state since Roe v. Wade. This is unacceptable. Abortion is necessary for women to live full and free lives. When women are forced to have children against their will, it's a form of enslavement. And this is a moment for people to raise their voices, to put their bodies on the line, to say, we refuse to let this happen. We must resist.
We are
people who are doing the on-the-ground work here in Texas.
We're out here because it's an utter emergency for the women of Texas, but for the women across the country. When abortion is illegal, women die from illegal abortions. You don't stop abortion, you just make it unsafe and dangerous for women, and millions of women have their lives foreclosed by forced motherhood.
It's female enslavement.
We want to put an example before all the students at UT Austin, but also in front of young people across this country that nothing changes. No struggle for justice has ever made any advances without putting your bodies and your voices and your future on the line. Everybody's here, they're training, learning and studying about who they want to be in the world, what kind of career they want to have. Our question is, what kind of world do you want to live in? And what are you willing to put on the line to ensure that women, half of humanity, are not enslaved? This is a local emergency, but it's really a flashpoint in a national battle. And it underscores even more why it's so important for people here on the ground to stand up.
And that we're calling for humanity. When abortion.
In this show, we talk a lot about the system. And we talk a lot about the system of capitalism and imperialism. And in society, people throw these words around, but people mean very different things by them. So for this next segment, we want to bring you a few excerpts from Bob Avakian's 2003 talk, Revolution, Why It's Necessary, Why It's Possible, and What It's All About, where he goes very deeply and scientifically into what is a system and what is the system of capitalism and imperialism. Also, through this, you'll get a sense of who this leader is. So let's watch.
Now, in this talk, I'm going to be using the words society and system a lot. By society, I mean a group of people who come together or are brought together for common aims and purposes. And in particular, I mean a society on the level of a country, where people live in a territory together and have the same government, like the United States or Brazil or Egypt or China. By system, I mean an organized way that something is held together and works. Systems have a certain order to them and certain ways in which things are done. Sometimes this is set down in formal rules and regulations or even laws, and sometimes it's just something that everybody has learned and carries out without the need for laws and people assigned to enforce them. For example, a game of cards or dominoes is a system. You have to play these games a certain way or it won't work. You can't put a domino any old place you want, any time you want, and try to think the game's going to work. What the fuck you doing, man? And the same is true of a game of cards or bid whist, spades, or poker. You can't just play any card you want, any time you want, or else you've broken the system and the thing won't work. The same is true of a game like basketball, which is organized in a different way than, let's say, football. You can't just take the ball and run down the court with it in basketball. You have to dribble it or pass it. And in soccer, you can't use your hands unless you're the goalie. Soccer has a different system. A song also has a system. It has certain notes and musical patterns and rhythms, and it often has certain lyrics. If you don't sing the right lyrics or sing the right tune, then you're not singing that song. Or maybe you're not singing at all. Human societies are organized into systems too. As I will get into through the course of this talk, different societies throughout history have been organized into different systems. And at this stage of human history, there is the possibility to bring into being a radically different society with a radically different system. As I said, I'm going to talk about how all these things flow from the very nature of the system and why it cannot be reformed. It must be done in and done away with. We need a revolution, the most radical revolution in the history of humanity. If you want to eliminate a problem or an evil, you must get to the root of it. If you want to eliminate the oppression and miserable conditions of the masses of people in the world today, you have to dig down to the underlying foundation, the ground in which this oppression and misery is rooted, and which continually gives rise to this oppression and suffering. You cannot get rid of a poisonous plant and create something healthy in its place just by pulling up the top of the plant. You have to pull it up from the roots and then grow something completely different and change the soil too. That is what a radical solution is. Radical means having to do with the root. And this is why a real revolution is needed, and this is what it's all about. Now, fundamental things about the world are hidden from us. Fundamental refers to the foundation, like the foundation of a house or another building, the thing that everything rests on. So what is the fundamental thing about how the world works that is hidden from us? The fundamental thing that goes on in the world every day that enables human beings to live and have a society is the exchange of labor among people. Now, like I said, this is not at all obvious. If there were only 6 people in the entire world, or we had 6 people just by themselves living together, this would be more obvious, because then the 6 of them would get together and they'd say, okay, what are you going to do? Maybe you're going to go out and hunt for food. Maybe you're going to go out and find materials to build a house. Maybe you two are going to work on constructing the house. And you would see how everybody's labor, in one form or another, contributed to people being able to survive and interact with each other in a society. But we don't have 6 people in the world. We have 6 billion. And they live not just in one little place, but all over the globe. But still, the same fundamental thing is going on. If you go to work, you put in a certain amount of work. You get back a certain amount of money in exchange for that work. You go buy certain products at the store or whatever, and then you take them to your house and use them, and you exchange things in that kind of a way. This goes on in such an everyday way that we don't even stop and think about it. But you are actually exchanging things indirectly through all these different stages with people all over the various parts of the globe. Think about it this way. Don't do it right now. But when you go home, check out your clothes. Look at the labels on them. Don't just look at where it says what company brand is on the clothes. But look where it says where these clothes or other things you have were made. In Nicaragua, in Honduras, in Haiti, in Pakistan, in Egypt, all over the world. We are exchanging things, and ultimately and fundamentally we're exchanging labor. People in those countries are putting in a certain amount of labor, and we're putting in a certain amount, and that's being exchanged through the form of the way in which we buy things with money. But it's not very obvious, because partly they want to keep it hidden from us, and the other reason is there are things that get in the way of our seeing that very clearly. First is the fact that there are all these intermediate steps. We're not the 6 people directly exchanging labor with each other. We're exchanging money, getting something. The remote character of where it came from is not obvious unless you do go read those labels, for example. So that's kind of one thing that keeps it hidden from us, is that here's somebody working in a sweatshop in Pakistan making the shirt that you wear, and you're over here putting in a certain amount of work so that you get the money to be able to go to buy that shirt when it gets to a store that you go to. You're exchanging the labor you put in for the labor they put in to make that shirt, but it goes through so many stages in between that you don't see that. But the other thing that gets in the way, and today the more significant thing, is that each of these steps, someone steps in and says, wait a minute, that's mine, I own it, I'm going to sell it. Not you who made it, me who made you make it. That someone is the capitalist. That's the system we live under. We don't work and exchange our labor directly, or we don't even exchange the products of what we produce with our labor directly. Some capitalist takes it at each stage, says this is mine, and sells it to someone else. And down the line it goes, each time going through another capitalist. But this is what's underlying all that. As I said, go look again at your clothes. Think of the small children who were working 12 and 14 hours a day, making those clothes for pennies an hour if they get that. See if you can see the tears of the children and their blood and bones that go into making those things. See if you can hear the muffled cry and the moans of those children as they're forced to work under these conditions in order to try to live. So what is this wonderful system under which all this takes place? What is capital and what is capitalism as a system? Capital is a relation of domination, of exploitation, and capitalism is a system based on exploitation. Sometimes people think of capital as money. You heard him talk on the financial channel. Oh, he has so much capital, meaning so much money to invest. And money is one form that capital takes. But that is not the heart and not the essence of it. In a deeper sense, money is only the outward expression of capital. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I've talked a little bit about the exchange of labor between people, the muffled cries and moans of the children, who make all, not just the clothes, but many of the other things we use. Or let's ask another question. This stock market with its clanging bell we hear about all the time. What are they trading on the stock market? Where does the wealth come from that they're trading in when they buy shares and stocks in different companies and bonds? They're trading in human flesh. They're trading in human suffering. They're trading in what's drained out of those children and out of other people, with their bones literally broken and their skin literally going into the things that are produced. That's where that wealth is created before the capitalist takes it and says it's mine. That's what they're trading in on the stock market. They're trading in exploitation and degradation of people all over the world, including tens of millions or hundreds of millions of children. Capitalism, especially now that it has reached the stage of imperialism, controls, dominates, manipulates, and mangles the lives of people all over the world. Many times you hear these imperialists and their mouthpieces say things like this. Well, you say we're exploiting people, but without us there'd be no jobs. They come out with, especially when it comes to light, that they are paying people something like a few cents an hour in countries all over the third world. No. The truth is that without these imperialists, there would still be people capable of working, people capable of planning and running an economy. There would still be natural resources and potential wealth for the people in those countries when they take control over their societies and remake them in a radical way through revolution. But then, what there would be is no capital, no capitalism, no imperialism exploiting and robbing the people and plundering their countries. And the masses of people everywhere in the world would be much better off. You cannot make this system into something else than what it is. So long as it rules, so long as it is in effect, everything that it does, all the ways it makes people suffer all over the world will continue and only get worse. Because that's the only way this system can operate.
"20 years of America's longest war has now come to an inglorious end. We said here on the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show that this defeat is something we welcome, but not because the reactionary Taliban has come to power, but because this defeat shows that the U.S. imperialists are not all powerful, that once again they have been sent scurrying by one of the poorest countries in the world. They are not all powerful, and they are not the good guys. The U.S. launched the war in Afghanistan to deliver a bloody message to the world in response to the al-Qaeda deadly terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001. This launched a horrific war of terror that they billed as a war on terror. It was a war to enforce their imperialist empire. 2 weeks ago in episode number 66, I brought out these cold-blooded facts about the American good guys and the liberation they promised at the tip of a drone-guided missile. When al-Qaeda flew hijacked planes into the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, 9/11, they took the lives of nearly 3,000 people. The U.S. then launched its so-called war on terror that would soon stretch into Iraq and points east and south. They caused the deaths of over 1 million people, most of them civilians, and at least 110,000 and perhaps as many 210,000 in Afghanistan alone. The violence unleashed by the United States has been staggering. Between 2004 and 2018, it dropped over 38,000 bombs on Afghanistan. And as of March 2020, it carried out over 12,000 drone strikes. More than half the country is food insecure, with half the children under 5 malnourished. And in fact, this so-called fighter against terrorism, the United States has killed nearly 10 million people since the end of World War II in its wars and coups and proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Guatemala, Iran, Iraq, Chile, El Salvador. The list goes on, end quote. And then, just yesterday, the USA was gone from Afghanistan. Mr. Here's the deal. President Joe Biden tried to prettify and justify this out of his concern for American lives. He would not send more of the U.S. soldiers into this endless war. But let us not be naive. Let us not fail to see that at the heart of this deal is that Biden and a section of the U.S. rulers see getting out of Afghanistan as a way to better fight for U.S. imperialism remaining top dog in a dog-eat-dog imperialist system. Here's part of Joe Biden's remarks on the eve of the withdrawal on August 31st.
Here's a critical thing to understand. The world is changing. We're engaged in a serious competition with China. We're dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts with Russia. We're confronted with cyber attacks and nuclear proliferation. To those who wish America harm, to those who engage in terrorism against us or our allies, know this: the United States will never rest. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We'll hunt you down to the ends of the earth, and you will pay the ultimate price.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down to the ends of the earth, and you will pay the ultimate price, end quote. And that didn't take long. In exiting Afghanistan, from current unconfirmed reports, it seems that the U.S. launched a revenge drone strike that killed a family of 10 with 7 children, the father of whom actually worked for an NGO charity in California. When Biden speaks of we, you should not let him include you in the we. The we he speaks of wants to involve you, make you complicit in their competition to dominate the world for U.S. capitalist imperialist interests that have brought humanity to this dystopic impasse. We, the millions of oppressed people and people who desire a just, sustainable world where all of humanity could flourish, have different and opposed interests to that of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, as well as to that of the bloated pig Donald Trump and the fascist lunatic Republican Party. The fight between these two parties is, yes, over the form of rule of this system, and that is fundamentally a fight between rulers over how to dominate and plunder the world, when to carry out murder and mayhem to enforce that rule. It is not a fight over ending oppression and exploitation. It is worth noting that in withdrawing from Afghanistan, Biden is carrying out Trump's strategy and the treaty that Trump signed. Biden may try to shift the blame to Trump for the messy, disastrous exit, as Trump and the fascists try to blame it all on Biden, while some in both parties think that the U.S. military should have stayed fighting in Afghanistan. What stands out is none of their answers are even remotely in the interests of humanity anywhere in the world, including in Afghanistan. Our interests are to get rid of this outmoded system that dominates, dehumanizes, degrades, oppresses, represses, and slaughters millions, and is on track to destroy the ecology of the planet we live on. Our interests require revolution, nothing less. As we have said before tonight, and we've said many times in the show, and we will continue to do so, because the declaration and call to get organized now for a real revolution is the mission of these times. Quote, "This is one of those rare times and circumstances when revolution becomes possible, not just because this system is always a horror, but because the crisis and deep divisions in society can now only be resolved through radical means of one kind or another, either radically reactionary, murderously oppressive and destructive means, or radically emancipatory, revolutionary means. Those who have ruled over us for so long with their Republican and Democratic parties are now caught up in bitterly fighting each other over how to hold this country together, keep this system going, enforce its rule over people it exploits and oppresses, and maintain this country as the world's top dog oppressive power. The Republicans are moving to exercise this rule through fascism, the discarding and pretense of democracy for all, relying on naked brutality and trampling on people's rights, to enforce undisguised and aggressive male supremacy, white supremacy, xenophobia, the hatred of foreigners and the persecution of immigrants, especially from non-white countries, and crude America First chauvinism. The Democrats are trying to keep things together with more disguise and deception, with the claim that what exists in this country is a great democracy representing the will of the people, and for this reason it deserves to be and needs to be the most powerful force in the world, end quote. In episode number 66, I made 4 points that are worth recapping. Number 1, this humiliating defeat for the U.S. can have important, potentially positive ramifications for the prospects for revolution. Number 2, the United States was not a liberator and is not the good guys. Number 3, the Taliban is a reactionary force that will bring a nightmare for the people, especially the women of Afghanistan. And number 4, there is a whole far better way that the world could be through revolution, guided by and for the objectives of the new communism. So now I'd like to move to just a brief interview I did with Bo Cogin, who is a member of the Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. He's a veteran of the Iraq War, and he brings up a perspective to this America's not the good guys that I think is really worth listening to. Okay, I'm here with Bo Cogin, a member of the Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, Bo.
Great to be here.
I wanted to talk about what's in the Declaration and call to get organized now for a real revolution. Right in the beginning of this declaration, it says, it is that the system of capitalism, imperialism destroys lives and crushes spirits. It is the source of endless horrors for the majority of people in this country and around the world, and it is increasingly threatening the very existence of humanity. Then it goes on to say, the military of this country is not carrying out an honorable service, and it is not some badass force that people should respect. It is doing the same thing around the world on a massive scale that the police are doing here, carrying out the cowardly killing and terrorizing of people in the service of the biggest oppressors in the world, the rulers of this country. How do you see this in terms of looking back on your experience that the U.S. military, that we're not the good guys, and more than that, it's not just some badass force?
I mean, you can just see their actions over there. I mean, constant raids, the drone strikes, the night raids. You know, they claim they have to do the night raids because it's a tactical advantage. No, it's so that they can terrorize people. So it's like, oh, you know, it's bad enough that you're getting fucked with during the day. You can't even go to sleep without them coming in and fucking with you. I mean, just the way their presence is over there. I mean, they would call the people of Iraq savages. I mean, you talk about like hearkening back to like John Wayne kind of attitude of cowboys and Indians. I mean, like, so it's no like surprise that became like a common term that was used. And the one really point that really is always cemented to me is this is the highest rate of institutional rape of a force out there. I mean, and a military is a direct reflection of the kind of society that it's part of. So, I mean, is anyone actually really surprised that, you know, women that join the military basically, you know, you hear about these stories, they get bladder infections because they're afraid to go to the bathroom at night because they're going to get raped by their own fellow service members. And, and that's just what they're doing amongst themselves.
You came to understand this more fully when you got out of the military, but you've also go out and talked to a lot of vets about this. So how do you see this question of really getting to these vets, getting to the larger public to say, no, this is not thank you for your service. This service is not a service to humanity. It's a service in the interests of empire.
I mean, there's a moral question here. I mean, people really got to ask themselves, like, why is it that we are okay? Why is it that these service members actually do go along with this? I mean, you actually got to hold yourself accountable. That's at least 50% of the equation for me, was I actually had to say to myself, wait, I'm okay with basically being a sociopath? You know what I mean? Or am I going to really dig? Am I going to really ask the questions, And the people in America, if you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror, you need to start digging and you need to start asking those questions. You need to hold these people in the military accountable, So like this comparison to them to the police, that's spot on. You know what I mean? Luckily or beautifully, because of the beautiful uprising, people are starting to open their eyes to what these pigs are doing to people here. Well, we need to start opening our eyes to what this military is doing over there and stop sticking our heads in the sands. You know what I mean?
And we need to make sure that literally thousands and tens of thousands of vets from this experience, many of whom are in terrible straits now, committing suicide in record numbers and suffering from PTSD, that they actually see who it was they were serving, and that the unjustness of that is part of what drives them to such desperation today, and that there is a different way the world could be. And when people like yourself and other vets turn and say, I'm going to be opposed to the force that I was working for and carrying out all this brutality, boy, that's a powerful thing. And I really respect you for getting out there in front in this time when not so many vets are stepping forward the way they did in the wake of Vietnam and during the Vietnam War. It's a brave thing to do, and it's an important thing. It's an important voice for our show. So thanks for being back on the show, Bo.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay. In closing this commentary and segment on the defeat of the U.S. in Afghanistan, it must be said that Biden is not alone in trumpeting his inglorious exit from Afghanistan. Bill Maher, in his August 27th show, had this to say to all those who oppose what the U.S. does around the world, and specifically what it did in Afghanistan. He took on the voice of an immigrant from almost any country in the world, and he said, quote, all you do is bitch about and badmouth your own country, but if you knew about the country I came from, you'd stop shitting on your own. To this and more, Bob Avakian has issued a challenge to Bill Maher that is on revcom.us. Hey, Bill Maher, here's a politically incorrect truth that can't be canceled. America is not and has never been great, except in one way. It is the world's greatest oppressor and destroyer of the environment. Do you dare take up the challenge of trying to refute this? With that, we'll go to the conclusion of our show.
Now I can just hear these reactionary fools saying, well, Bob, answer this. If this country is so terrible, why do people come here from all over the world? Why are so many people trying to get in, not to get out? Maybe we can imagine someone like Vice President Dick Cheney, that crooked-mouthed monster and worldwide mass murderer. Maybe we can imagine him saying something like this. Yes, Bob, why is that? Why? I'll tell you why. Because you have fucked up the rest of the world even worse than what you have done in this country.
So with that, I'm going to wrap up today's show with a few comments. I was surprised to see last week in the Hollywood Reporter an article titled Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Why the Hosts of Jeopardy Matters. And I thought this was going to be another discussion of the allegations against the newly appointed host who is now withdrawn. But Kareem went and said, this is about more than that. Quote, it's about acknowledging Jeopardy's significance as an enriching leader in promoting the joys and benefits of education. This is especially important considering the assault against intelligence and critical thinking the country has faced in recent years. The introduction of the scientific method in the 17th century lifted humanity out of the fetid and superstitious Dark Ages. He went on to say, today, science deniers shake their fists and rattle their pitchforks at any facts they don't like. History deniers ignore eyewitness accounts, documentation, and indisputable evidence to spin their own narratives that make them feel good about their biases. The problem is that they can cause serious harm to society, future generations, and the country itself. I thought this was an interesting article. It's something I hadn't realized before about the show Jeopardy, but it makes some important points. So that's my first point. Next, I feel it would be remiss for us not to acknowledge the death of Ed Asner at the age of 91. Ed Asner was an actor. Many of you may have known of him in seeing reruns or the originals of Ed playing Lou Grant in the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He was a big city editor. And then he had his own show that was a spinoff, the Lou Grant Show. In this show, the Lou Grant character was a big city editor, and he pursued stories in the first season that were not covered that much in situation comedies on TV in the 70s and 80s. Serious issues like domestic abuse, gang rivalries, neo-Nazi groups, nursing home scandals, and other things like this. Ed Asner was in many films and plays. He did some wonderful voiceover of children's movies. I last saw him in 2012 in the play Grace on Broadway. He was a really fine actor, and he brought a lot of heart to his art. But here I want to acknowledge that Ed was somebody who stood with the oppressed of the planet. He really stood with the people. As an actor, he became active in the Screen Actors Guild, and he was its president for a couple of years, going up against these right-wing fascist types like Ronald Reagan and Charlton Heston. He, in fact, went up against Ronald Reagan in opposing the way that Reagan broke the strike of these air traffic controllers, which was a first effort at really breaking and busting the unions in this country, unfortunately successful. But one of Ed Asner's biggest issues was defending and standing up for the people of El Salvador in their war against the United States-backed reactionary armies in El Salvador. And he eventually paid the price of having his sponsors threaten to pull from his show, and his show was canceled on television. But Ed supported many different issues, and I want to speak about a few. And after, as I talked about earlier in today's show, the Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center and the war on terror that the U.S. launched, we, the revolutionary communists inspired by Bob Avakian, began an organization and worked with many other people called Not in Our Name that placed full-page ads in newspapers all across the country and the world condemning the war that was about to start. In fact, we had an evening of conscience in New York City with many prominent actors, and including Ed Asner, reading at this and standing up against the war before it began. Ed Asner went on and worked with the people those of us who started Not in Our Name when we formed the organization World Can't Wait to drive out the Bush regime in the early 2000s. That was, again, an anti-war organization. The very things we're talking about today about Afghanistan, Ed Asner was there with us in lending his name, lending his voice, and it really mattered. I remember being with him at a benefit out here in Hollywood during that period. In 2011, there was a hunger strike at Pelican Bay that included black and brown prisoners. It was a very important and courageous and heroic strike, and many people from the arts signed, and other academic and scientists signed statements in support of them. Ed Asner issued this personal statement. And if you have seen Ed, you can hear his voice instead of mine. America the beautiful, what a crock. Ask the over 6,000 prisoners in California who are willing to starve themselves to death to achieve more humane conditions. If not for them, then for those in the future who will be condemned to such vile servitude. The punishment and intolerance meted out to them makes the state more criminal than the prisoners. For God's sakes, stop the illegal executions inflicted by the state in its maximum security prisons, end quote. Ed Asner also stood up for the political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was a journalist in Philadelphia who was framed for killing a policeman, allegedly, and he was condemned to death, and only recently was that changed to life in prison, and he should have been never arrested and imprisoned, and he should be released from prison now, and he's a courageous journalist to this day. And then in 2014, Bob Avakian held a dialogue at Riverside Church in New York City with Cornel West on revolution and religion. And Ed Asner made this statement to encourage people to come to the dialogue. Quote, "I have been a fan of Cornel West for many years. I have been deeply impressed by his intelligence and his purity, and to find him in dialogue with Bob Avakian, a fearless leader of the left, is a consummation to be wished for. If hope and clarity can only come from this dialogue to lighten the dark times we live in, then I would wish this same dialogue will be played throughout the land. We need it desperately," end quote. So as we say, presente, Ed Asner. Recently, Bob Avakian has written 3 important articles on the COVID pandemic. They are now put together in a pamphlet which you can get at Revolution Books in New York and Berkeley, and you can download and print the pamphlet for yourself on revcom.us. The articles are titled, "Vaccines Are a Decisive Means for Dealing with COVID. They are not a conspiracy or a plot by the government and big corporations. The importance of a scientific understanding and approach." Prior to that, he wrote, from Bob Avakian on COVID, "The importance of getting people vaccinated and the very real problem regarding rampant individualism." And also from Bob Avakian is a short piece titled, "Important Points of Theory and Method Regarding Freedom and Restrictions on Freedom." These 3 articles are about the COVID pandemic, but they're about much more. They're about method, approach, science, and society, and what our responsibility is to each other. So with that, we're going to close today's show. I want to say I appreciate your watching us tonight, and saying good night for myself and for Sunsara Taylor and the whole crew here at the RNL Show, and we'll see you next Thursday.